let's talk virtualization. What not to do except the defaults, right? Randy talked about this. It's commodity hardware. You need to know what you're doing, right? You 100% know what you're doing, and incorrect configuration can have a significant impact on the performance in any virtualization environment, right? We're going to talk about primarily VMware and Hyper-V because that's what we see the most of. I already mentioned this, right? Anytime we go into there, these are targeted toward commodity hardware, right? And it's not really aimed at IO intensive apps, and that's what SQL Server is, right? It's IO intensive, right? So you have to go in there and change that information. So things to consider, right? Especially when you're doing virtualization, is it boils down to three things, right? You want to look at CPU, memory, and disk. So when you're looking at CPU, you want to make sure that you're not overcommitted on CPU. You want to make sure you're not overcommitted on memory. Randy, we talked about virtual controllers. Randy can jump in here.
Yeah.
On this. Yeah. But and there's the hot, for VMware, there's the hot plug, right? You do not want to turn on hot plug in VMware because it messes up your NUMA, right? But you do want to turn that on memory, right? I got a link here to the VMware doc that talks about best practices for VMware. But again, virtual controllers. Randy, you want to jump in? And
Sure. So I would go so far as to say is that probably 9 out of 10 SQL Server VMs that we look at are configured as a what I call a commodity virtual machine, right? Because that's how our vSphere environment was. I'm talking about VMware, but Hyper-V is the same way. That's how our environment was set up. We have a template. Boom. Here's your VM. Install SQL Server. The biggest issue that we see. So there's two issues: memory reservations. SQL Server does not do well with memory being moved around on it, right? It's going to use all the memory that you give it. So you always want to reserve all of the memory for SQL Server. You don't want to use dynamic memory in Hyper-V or, in VMware where you can just, allow it to, control memory however it wants, right? You can get away with CPU without a reservation, but you for sure want a memory reservation. And the other is on disk. We see people with, really high-end back-end arrays, really high, stuff like, the Cisco UCS system or HPE, hyper-converged infrastructure, all, really high-end hardware. But by default, VMware, as an example, uses one disk controller, and the controller type is an LSI SAS. VMware has a paravirtual SCSI disk controller that you should always use for high I/O workloads. So that's number one. Number two, you can have up to 4 disk controllers in one virtual machine, and you should use them all, right? You can leave your OS drive on the LSI SAS, that's fine, but you want 3 additional paravirtual SCSI controllers, and you want to separate out like your data, your log, your tempdb. If you have a backup volume, you don't want your data volume and your backup volume to be on the same controller because you're reading and writing through that same path, right? So this is the biggest issue that we see. We see people with really high-end storage that, we're seeing latency in SQL Server, and the storage guys are saying, what are you talking about? It's sub-millisecond, right? Well, there's all kinds of moving parts in between SQL Server and the actual array, right? And we want to look at that entire path. And, we've seen situations like that where, we were seeing really high latency in SQL Server. The storage is seeing nothing. All we did was change it to paravirtual SCSI, spread it out across multiple controllers, and format the drive 64K instead of 4K, and the latency issues disappeared, right? So you really need to make sure that your SQL Server virtual machines are designed for SQL Server at the hypervisor level.